On True Crime Threads, we uncover the chilling story of Isabel Ferrera, a Venezuelan woman wrongfully deported and brutally murdered in El Salvador. Was it a mistake, or was she sacrificed to protect someone else? In early 2023, Camila Rojas, a 28-year-old Venezuelan woman, had built a quiet life in Houston, Texas. She had fled Venezuela years earlier, escaping economic turmoil and political instability, hoping to find safety and stability in the United States. While waiting for her asylum case to be processed, she worked as a waitress at a small diner, earning just enough to pay rent for her modest apartment. She stayed out of trouble, avoided unnecessary risks, and focused on her goal of building a future far from the hardships she had left behind. One morning before sunrise, a group of immigration officers conducted a raid at her apartment complex, targeting individuals with outstanding deportation orders. The operation was swift and chaotic, with officers knocking on doors, checking identification, and detaining anyone who couldn't immediately prove their legal status. Camila, still groggy from sleep, was caught off guard when they knocked on her door. She had done nothing wrong, had no criminal record, and had all the necessary paperwork to show she was in the country legally while awaiting her asylum hearing. However, in a critical clerical mistake, her name had been mistakenly linked to another person, someone with a deportation order. When the officers scanned their database, Camila's name appeared as a match. She protested, desperately trying to explain that there had been an error, but her words fell on deaf ears. In the confusion of the raid, her paperwork was dismissed, and she was taken into custody. Her phone was confiscated, and she had no way to contact anyone who could help her. Within hours, she was transported to a detention center, processed with minimal review, and placed on a deportation flight. When the plane landed at San Salvador International Airport, Camila found herself in a country she had never set foot in. She had no family, no connections, and no idea where to go. The local authorities at the airport barely acknowledged her presence. Immigration officials in El Salvador had no record of her and treated her as just another deportee. With no valid Salvadoran identification, she was denied any form of assistance. Stepping outside the airport, she was met with oppressive heat and the sight of unfamiliar surroundings. She had only the clothes on her back and a deep sense of fear. She tried to approach a few people for help, but they either ignored her or walked away. Some looked at her with suspicion, while others seemed indifferent. As night fell, her desperation grew. She had no money, no way to contact her family, and nowhere to sleep. Hunger gnawed at her, and exhaustion weighed down her body. She wandered aimlessly, hoping to find a shelter or someone willing to assist her. Eventually, a man noticed her distress and offered her a ride, claiming he could take her somewhere safe. Desperate and with no better option, she hesitated only for a moment before accepting. She climbed into the car, unaware that this decision would mark the beginning of a nightmare she would never escape. Desperate and afraid, Camila wandered the streets of San Salvador, unsure of where to go. The man who had offered her a ride seemed friendly, insisting he knew of a place where she could stay. With no other options, she accepted, hoping he was telling the truth. The car ride was silent, except for the occasional sound of the city passing by. She tried to memorize the streets, but everything was unfamiliar. After nearly an hour of driving, they reached a dimly lit area on the outskirts of the city. He parked near an old building and gestured for her to get out. He assured her that the people inside could help. As soon as she stepped out, the car sped away, leaving her alone once again. Camila hesitated before approaching the building. The entrance was partially covered by a tattered curtain, and faint voices could be heard inside. When she stepped in, several people turned to look at her. Their expressions were unreadable, and a heavy tension filled the air. She quickly realized this was not a shelter. It was a rundown bar. And the people inside were mostly men, speaking in hushed tones. A woman behind the counter asked what she wanted. Camilla, feeling out of place, muttered that she was looking for help. The woman shook her head and told her to leave. Stepping back outside, she felt more lost than ever. Night had fully settled and the streets were nearly empty. She walked for hours, her body aching from exhaustion. She considered stopping to rest, but feared staying in one place for too long. Without a phone, she had no way of contacting anyone. The reality of her situation was sinking in. No one knew where she was, and no one was coming to help. The next morning, a street vendor saw her sitting on a bench near a bus stop, looking tired and disoriented. He offered her a small piece of bread, which she gratefully accepted. Through broken Spanish, she tried to ask if he knew of a place where she could find help. He gestured toward the city center, advising her to seek assistance there. Gathering what little energy she had left, she followed his direction. By noon, she reached a busier part of the city. The streets were filled with people, cars, and the sounds of daily life. She approached a police officer, hoping he could guide her to an embassy or a shelter. He listened for a moment before shaking his head. Without identification, there was nothing he could do. Frustrated and defeated, she walked away, unsure of what to do next. Later that evening, she was seen accepting a ride from two men in a black SUV. A fruit vendor nearby noticed her hesitancy before stepping into the vehicle. She seemed uncertain but desperate. The SUV pulled away, disappearing into traffic. That was the last time anyone saw her. 2 days later, she was reported missing, but in a city plagued by violence, few took notice. Investigators initially struggled to find a motive. The crime scene showed signs of extreme violence, suggesting the attack had been personal rather than opportunistic. Yet Camilla had no known enemies in El Salvador. She had never even set foot in the country before. With no clear leads, the case risked becoming another unsolved murder in a place where justice was rare. It wasn't until an immigration lawyer in Texas began reviewing her deportation records that the first real clue emerged. The paperwork contained a disturbing inconsistency. Camilla had not been deported under her own name. Further examination revealed that her official deportation documents listed her as Carla Rojas, a Venezuelan woman who had entered the United States months earlier and later disappeared. Unlike Camilla, Carla had a past that made her a target. She had provided testimony against a cartel involved in human trafficking, drug smuggling, and contract killings. After testifying, she had gone into hiding, and authorities suspected she had either escaped or been silenced. But if Carla had vanished, why had Camilla been deported under her name? The mistake could not have been coincidental. Deportation cases required multiple verifications, and yet Camilla's name had been swapped for Carla's without raising any red flags. Either an administrative failure of staggering proportions had occurred, or someone had deliberately altered her records. If the latter was true, it meant Camilla had been deported with a target on her back. In El Salvador, cartels operated with ruthless efficiency. Surveillance was constant and informants worked everywhere inside police forces, government agencies, and even international organizations. The moment Camilla stepped off that deportation flight, her arrival would have been noticed. Cartel members expecting Carla Rojas would have received word that she had returned. They would have acted swiftly. Forensic reports only deepened the suspicion that this had not been a simple robbery. Camilla had suffered prolonged torture before her death, a method often used by cartels to extract information. But Camilla had nothing to give them. She had no knowledge of Carla's dealings, no connection to the criminal underworld, and no idea why she was being targeted. In her final hours, she had likely pleaded for her life, trying to explain that they had the wrong person. Her captors either didn't believe her or didn't care. If Carla had betrayed them, her suffering was meant to be a warning. Even if they had realized Camilla wasn't Carla, by then it was too late. They couldn't let her go. What investigators still didn't know was who had orchestrated the mix-up. Did the cartel have someone inside the immigration system feeding them information? Had someone deliberately sent Camila to her death to protect the real Carla Rojas? If so, where was Carla now? What began as a case of mistaken identity was beginning to look like something far worse. A deliberate setup. Camila had never been meant to survive her deportation. She had been unknowingly delivered into the hands of killers. A deeper investigation revealed that the error in Camila's deportation wasn't random. At first, authorities assumed it was a bureaucratic oversight, the kind of mistake that happened in an overwhelmed system processing thousands of cases. But the more they examined the details, the more it became clear that someone had intentionally altered her records. The question was why. Deportation documents required multiple approvals, and yet Camila had been processed under a false identity without anyone noticing. That kind of mistake didn't happen without help from inside. The first breakthrough came when a journalist uncovered a pattern. Camila wasn't the only asylum seeker who had disappeared after being deported under suspicious circumstances. Several cases involved individuals who had been mistakenly classified as different people before being sent back to dangerous countries. Some had vanished entirely, while others had been found dead within days of arrival. Have been found dead within days of arrival. The discovery pointed to a systematic failure, or worse, deliberate sabotage within the immigration system. A former government employee, speaking anonymously, provided crucial insight. He claimed that certain officials were involved in selling sensitive data about asylum seekers to criminal organizations. In exchange for money, these insiders leaked names, case statuses, and upcoming deportations. The cartels used this information to track down individuals who had fled them, ensuring that no one could escape their reach. Camila's case, however, was different. She had no cartel connections, no criminal past, and no reason to be targeted until someone changed her identity. Investigators now believe that her deportation had been manipulated to make it appear that Carla Rojas had been returned to El Salvador. But why would anyone go to such lengths to fake Carla's deportation? The answer likely involved the cartel itself. If Carla was still alive, she was in hiding for a reason. Perhaps she had made a deal with authorities, trading information for protection. If that was true, then her survival depended on the cartel believing she was dead. By sending Camila in her place, someone had effectively closed the case on Carla. The cartel had been given a victim, and the real Carla Rojas had been given more time to disappear. But who had arranged this? Corrupt officials had the power to alter records, but they wouldn't have done it without a reason. The only logical conclusion was that someone with access to high-level information had orchestrated the switch, knowing that the cartel would act swiftly once they thought Carla had been found. Whether this person was working for the cartel or for someone else remained unclear. What was certain was that Camila had unknowingly been sacrificed to protect a woman she had never met. Her wrongful deportation had never been a mistake, it had been an execution order. By the time authorities connected the pieces, it was too late to hold anyone accountable. The corruption that had sealed her fate remained in place, and those responsible continued their work, ensuring that more names would disappear into the system, just as Camila had. Following media pressure, the U.S. government launched an internal investigation into the wrongful deportation cases. What started as a single tragic mistake soon unraveled into a much larger scandal. Reports emerged of asylum seekers being deported under incorrect names, their identities deliberately switched before being sent back to dangerous regions. In some cases, these individuals had been flagged for protection, yet they were still placed on flights with no way of defending themselves. The practice had gone unnoticed for years, hidden within the overwhelming volume of immigration cases, but Camila's murder forced it into the spotlight. Her family, devastated by the news, demanded accountability. They had spent months believing she was safe, waiting for her asylum request to be processed. Instead, she had been sent to a country she had never known, where she was hunted down and killed. The realization that her death had been avoidable made their grief unbearable. Her mother, speaking through tears in front of news cameras, described Camila as a kind and hard-working woman who had left Venezuela only to seek safety. Instead, she had been betrayed by the very system meant to protect her. Protests erupted, with activists calling for reforms to prevent such mistakes from happening again. Lawyers uncovered more cases of people who had disappeared after deportation, their families left without answers. Whistleblowers came forward exposing a network of corruption within immigration agencies, where officials altered records in exchange for bribes. Some had been working with criminal organizations, while others had been pressured by superiors to clear cases quickly, even if it meant cutting corners. Despite the growing outrage, those directly responsible for Camila's wrongful deportation faced little consequence. Several lower-level employees were dismissed, and a few officials were arrested for document tampering, but the larger system remained intact. The individuals who had truly orchestrated the scheme, the ones who had profited from selling asylum seekers information, were never publicly named. The case, despite its shocking details, was soon overshadowed by new headlines, and public attention slowly faded. Meanwhile, in El Salvador, the investigation into Camila's murder led nowhere. Authorities, already overwhelmed with crime, had little interest in pursuing justice for a foreign victim. The men who had taken her remained unidentified, and those who had given the order to kill her continued their work without fear of consequence. Her death was classified as a gang-related homicide, one of thousands each year, and the case was quietly closed. For those who knew her, Camila was more than a tragic story. She was a woman who had placed her trust in the system, believing that following the legal process would keep her safe. Instead, she had been turned into a pawn in a larger scheme, her life discarded to protect someone else. Her name became a symbol of the dangers faced by asylum seekers, but in the end, no one paid for what had happened to her. The world moved on, just as it always did, leaving behind only unanswered questions and a family still waiting for justice.